Welcome to this video. In this video we're going to discuss the human papillomavirus or HPV entry mechanism, so the mechanism by which the virus initially gains access to a host cell. So the first thing I want to do is set the scene. So human papillomaviruses, they infect squamous stratified epithelia of the human body. They don't infect other tissues, they don't cause systemic infections, they just infect squamous stratified epithelia. So the first thing I want to do is just talk a little bit about squamous stratified epithelia, describe the histology, and talk about the fact that there are two major categories of squamous stratified epithelia, namely keratinized squamous stratified epithelia and non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelia. After that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the different types of human papillomavirus and the structure of human papillomaviruses. Then we'll start the entry mechanism and we'll go through this in a lot of detail. So we'll look at how the virus initially binds to the cells, how it then gets endocytosed, and then how it makes its way through the endocytic pathway and then eventually gets into the nucleus, and that's where we'll end the video. So, the first thing then that I want to do is setting the scene by talking about squamous stratified epithelia. So let me just write this down here. So we are going to talk about squamous stratified epithelia, which are the tissues in the body that human papillomaviruses can infect. So squamous stratified epithelia. Okay, so you can gain a lot of understanding of squamous stratified epithelia just by having a look at the name here. So these two words, squamous and stratified, are significant. So let's start off with what stratified means. Stratified means that this epithelium is going to have multiple layers of cells. Contrast this to another term, which is simple epithelium. If you describe an epithelium as a simple epithelium, it means that there is only a single layer of cells. So stratified epithelia are epithelia that have multiple layers of cells. Then let's have a look at this other word, squamous, over here. That means flat. This refers to cells that are flat. You would describe a cell as a squamous cell if it's a very, very flat cell. Now, I'm just about to draw the structure of a squamous stratified epithelium in a moment, and we'll see that most of the cells in the squamous stratified epithelium are not actually flat. It's only the outer layer of cells that is actually flat. So when we call the epithelium a squamous stratified epithelium, this squamous is referring to the structure of the outermost layer of cells. You'll see that not all of the layers of cells of this epithelium are actually going to be squamous. Okay, so let's actually draw a picture then of a squamous stratified epithelium. So we'll start with the bottommost layer, which is going to be the basement membrane. So I think I'll draw this picture over here. So in red here, this is representing the basement membrane. And remember what a basement membrane is. All epithelia, which are these linings of the body, all of them, they are made up of cells, and the cells are sat on a basement membrane, which is a meshwork of proteins, and this is a rigid structure. This is what gives the epithelium rigidity. This is why the cells of the epithelium are actually going to remain in place, because they are bound to the basement membrane, or at least the most basal layer of cells, in the case of a stratified squamous epithelium, are going to be bound to the basement membrane. So here in red, this is a basement membrane, and for short, I'll abbreviate basement membrane down to BM, but I suppose I should probably write out the full name just once. So this is a basement membrane here in red. Okay, so that's the bottommost layer of the squamous stratified epithelium, and as I say, this thing is not made up of cells, this thing is made up of proteins and other molecules that are extracellular matrix components. So it's a meshwork. Imagine a spider's web meshwork of molecules that the cells are going to be sat upon. Okay, so next layer up from the basement membrane then is going to be the basal layer of cells, and these are going to be cuboidal in nature, so they're certainly not going to be squamous. So here in white, let me now draw the basal cells. So this is not just one basal cell. I'm going to split it up. So there's one, and here's another one, and I'll just finish this off quickly. So here are our basal cells, and as you can see, as I've already said, they are not squamous. So it's only going to be the most superficial layer of the squamous stratified epithelium that is actually going to be squamous. So these cells in white here, these are the basal cells, and you would refer to this single layer of basal cells as the basal cell layer. Now, these cells in the basal layer, they're going to be stem cells. They are going to be the cells that give rise to the entire squamous stratified epithelium. They are going to be the only cells in the squamous stratified epithelium that are dividing. Okay, all of the layers on top of the basal cell layer are not going to be dividing. So these are the only ones that are capable of dividing. They are stem cells. They're the cells from which the entire epithelium is going to stem. Right, so as I say, they're going to be dividing, and every time they divide, they will give rise to two daughter cells, and the two daughter cells will have very different fates normally. One of the daughter cells will remain in the basal cell layer and will replace its parent as a stem cell. So, for example, let's say this one here divides, one of its progeny is going to stay in its position and remain as a stem cell. The other daughter cell is then going to move up into the more superficial layers, and then it's going to begin the differentiation process. It's going to change its properties hugely, and it's going to gradually become more and more squamous. So, we're going to have lots of layers of cells on top of the basal cell layer, and there are lots of different classifications of the different layers of a squamous stratified epithelium, and some of them are a lot more complicated than others. For our purposes, we do not need to pick a particularly complicated classification of the different layers of the squamous stratified epithelium. We can use a very simple classification, and that's what I'm going to do. So the simple classification I'm going to use is just going to split the layers of cells of the squamous stratified epithelium into three separate layers, and we've got one already, which is the basal cell layer. Above the basal cell layer, we're then going to have a layer, which is going to consist of multiple layers of cells, which is going to be called the midzone layer of cells. So the cells in this layer are going to be larger and rounder than the cells in the basal cell layer. So I'll draw a few of these here. There's one, and I'll try and get them to all be roughly the same size and shape. Here's another one, and I'll do a few underneath. Now, in my picture, how many layers am I going to fit in here? I'm going to try and fit in 4. Okay, so you can see that I haven't succeeded in keeping them all roughly the same size and shape, but never mind. Ideally, they would have all been roughly the same size and shape. I should have gone for 3 layers rather than 4 layers. I got greedy, and it's kind of ruined the picture by going for 4 layers rather than 3. Okay, but here is the basic idea. So we've got these round, large cells in this midzone layer. So this layer that I've got here in blue, this is going to be the midzone of the squamous stratified epithelium. So what's going to happen is when a basal cell divides, it will give rise to 2 progeny, and one of those daughter cells will remain in the basal cell layer and will remain a basal cell to replace its mother. And then the other will move up into the midzone and will start to change, it will start to differentiate. So differentiate is the fancy word for change, effectively, become a certain type of cell. So the stem cells are very sort of boring cells. They don't have any particular properties. Their job is to give rise to other cells that are going to be specialized for a specific purpose. So these daughter cells are going to go through the process of differentiation, and they're going to gradually become more and more specialized. So in the midzone layers, they're gradually they're gradually moving up here, and they have become bigger than the original basal cells down here and more round. And then above the midzone layer, we're going to have another layer of cells, which is going to be the superficial zone, which I'll do here in green. So this is another layer, and again this zone is going to consist of more layers than just one layer. Oh, and I should say, I have drawn for the midzone just 4 layers of cells there, and I might have ended up just drawing 3. There would in reality be more layers of cells than just 4. Overall, I think usually it's quoted that in a squamous stratified epithelium there are 20 layers of cells on top of one another. I'm not going to end up with 20 on top of my picture, I'm not going to even try. Okay, so the superficial zone then is going to consist of the squamous cells now. So the cells are going to move up through the midzone gradually, and then they're going to get into the superficial zone, and by the time they're in the superficial zone, they will have differentiated so much that they will now be the squamous cells, which I'm drawing here. So very, very flat cells, like so. Okay, and I think I'll split this up a little bit more. Right, there we go. So these cells, all these cells on top of the basal cell there, they have come from the basal cells. So the basal cells divide, they give rise to one basal cell that will remain there and one cell that will move up. And the cell gradually moves up through the midzone, and it's undergoing the differentiation process, and the midzone overall consists of these quite round cells that are getting ready to become squamous cells, and then as it gets up into the superficial zone, it's changed so much that it's now one of these squamous cells. And this is where we now need to talk about the fact that there are 2 different types of squamous stratified epithelia, because these squamous cells at the top, you can either put nuclei in them if you're talking about a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, or you can leave the nuclei out of the picture if we're talking about a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So let me now just mention this fact, so I'll just get a little bit more space here. So there are 2 different types of squamous stratified epithelium. One is the keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, and there is one major example of a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, which is the epidermis of the skin. So the outer layer of the skin, the layer on top of the dermis, which is the actual epithelium of the skin. So this is the epidermis of the skin, which we can also refer to as the cutaneous squamous stratified epithelium. Now, in a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, I keep trying to call this squatified, squamous stratified epithelium. In a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, the cells, as they move up into the most superficial layers, are going to become completely overloaded with a cytoskeletal component called keratin. So, obviously the name tells you how important keratin is. So keratin is a cytoskeletal component, and let me just remind you of what the cytoskeleton is. So remember, back when we were children learning about cells, we drew cells in this nice simple way, and indeed in my pictures I've drawn cells in these nice simple ways. You draw a cell membrane, you draw a nucleus, and then you have the cytoplasm, and that's incredibly simple, nice and easy for a child to be able to remember. You just have to draw one circle and then put a dot in the middle. So this is the nice simple way we draw cells, and this is the way I've been drawing them over here. However, cells do not look like this. The cytoplasm is not just a gloop. If it was, then cells would not have a permanent shape. If the cytoplasm was just a gloop, then the cell would continuously be changing its shape. It would be like jelly, effectively. Because the cell membrane, remember, that's just gloop, that's just lipids, so there's nothing rigid there. So why do cells usually keep their structure? It's because the cytoplasm is not just a gloop. The cytoplasm contains a rigid meshwork, very much so like this basement membrane that I've been talking about here. So inside the cytoplasm of cells, you have loads of little fibres. So I'll have some in green there, I'll draw some in blue. You have loads of fibres, protein fibres and carbohydrate fibres, loads of these fibres. And these are what we call the cytoskeleton. So I'll put this word here. So inside all of cells you have a rigid meshwork called the cytoskeleton, and this is what holds the cell in its shape. This holds the cell membrane up. This maintains a cell shape. This is the rigid structure of a cell. Now, keratin is one of the components of the cytoskeleton. There are lots of other components of the cytoskeleton as well. To give you some major examples, actin is a major component of the cytoskeleton, and also microtubules made up of tubulin monomers, they are a major component of the cytoskeleton as well. But keratin is one that we're finding important here. So, keratin is a little protein that you can join together to make massive, great filaments. So, loads and loads of keratin molecules, polypeptides, are joined together to make one of these fibers. So, do not think that one of these fibers in the cytoskeleton is just one keratin protein. No, it will consist of loads of keratin proteins all joined together to make something much bigger. Now, in a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, so in the epidermis of the skin that covers all of our bodies, the superficial zone of that squamous stratified epithelium, the cells in that layer become utterly overloaded with keratin. So in keratinized squamous stratified epithelia, the cells, as they undergo the differentiation process, gradually become more and more full of keratin. They become keratin overloaded. And they also lose their nuclei. So if I was drawing a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, such as the squamous stratified epithelium of the skin, which is the only major example, you would not have nuclei in the most superficial layers of the squamous stratified epithelium. So you would have them in the lower layers of the superficial zone, but as you go up to the most superficial layers here, you would start to lose your nuclei. And I think actually it's more a case that it's just the most outer layer that actually doesn't have nuclei in a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So, as we go up then, the most superficial layer here, they do not have nuclei anymore if we're talking about a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, and instead these cells are just overloaded with keratin. They're just bags of keratin, and these are very rigid, they're very strong, that means, because remember, keratin is a cytoskeletal component, and that's what gives the skin a nice rigidity to protect us all. Okay, so in a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, this is the picture that we would draw. The cells gradually become more and more differentiated, they overload with keratin, and they lose their nuclei as they become the outermost layer of the superficial zone of the keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Now, let's talk about the other type of a squamous stratified epithelium then, and we'll do this in purple here. So the other type is the non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Now, these, obviously in contrast to the keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, do not become keratin overloaded in the same way, and they do not lose their nuclei in the most outer layer. So I would put nuclei back in here if we're talking about a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So the most superficial layer of cells in a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium are not keratin overloaded in the same way that the most outer layer of a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium is, and they still have their nuclei, unlike in a keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Okay, so let me now talk about examples of non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelia. So, major famous examples. I mean, what is human papillomavirus famous for? It's famous for causing cervical cancer. And I've told you that human papillomavirus can only infect squamous stratified epithelia. Therefore, the layer of the cervix must be a squamous stratified epithelium, and indeed it is, and it's a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So, in fact, a lot of the lining of the most outer portions of the female reproductive tract are non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So, it's not just the cervix, but also the vulva mucosa is a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. And just so that everyone is clear what I mean when I say the vulva mucosa, the vulva, remember, is the name for the external female genitalia, and the vulvar mucosa refers to the lining inwards of the labia minora. So if I just draw a little picture of the female external genitalia, if we start by drawing the labia majora here, so this is the right labia majora, and this is the left labia majora. Those are covered by skin, those are not covered by non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. But then inside of that, you then have the labia minora, which I'll put here, like so, and the inside of those are covered by by non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Then inside of the labia minora you have what's called the vestibule, where you have the urethral opening. Unfortunately the picture's getting quite difficult to add this on. There's the urethral opening, and then you have the vaginal opening there. So this is a brief picture of the female external genitalia. These are the labia minora, these are the labia majora, here's the vaginal opening, here's the urethral opening, and all of this area is covered by a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So the inside of the labia minora, the vestibule, and then actually the inside of the vagina and the inside of the urethral canal is also covered by non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So let's just add this on. So we also have the vagina is lined by a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, and then the ectocervix is lined by a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So let me just explain what I mean by the ectocervix. So for this, let's just draw a picture of the female reproductive tract, and we'll do this in red, I think. We won't draw the entire thing, we'll just have the vagina and then the beginning of the cervix. So, like so. So, this is obviously the vagina here. Let's just give the wall of the vagina an actual thickness here. Actually, I'll do the cervix first. And here is the beginning of the cervix, which is the entrance to the uterus. Like so, and above it you would then have the uterus. Now, of course, these structures have to have a thickness, so I'm just going to do that like so. So here is my basic picture of the female reproductive tract, the most superficial portions. So this leads to this, of course. This is the fornix here, and this is the cervix. So I'll just label this up. So this is the beginning of the cervix here, and this is the vagina. Now, we can divide the epithelium that lines the cervix into two different parts. This portion here that is exposed to the vagina, this is called the ectocervix. So let me just get another colour to highlight this in, and in fact I'll do it in this pinky colour. So this portion here, and I'll just get a thicker pen, this bit here that I am highlighting in purple here, that is what we call the ectocervix. Whereas, so it's not part of the vaginal wall, the vagina is deemed to end here. Okay, this is now part of the cervix, and this is the part called the ectocervix. And this, just like the lining of the vagina, is a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Whereas, in contrast, this portion here that I'm now highlighting in green, this is very different. This is not a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. This is actually a simple columnar epithelium, and we're not interested in that bit because human papillomaviruses can't infect that bit. So the bit of the cervix that can become infected by human papillomaviruses, because it's a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, is this bit, the ectocervix here. Okay, so let me just get the thin pen back. So those are examples of non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Let's now do some more examples. So the male external genitalia also has a portion of non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So the fancy word for this portion is the preputial mucosa. And this is the inside lining of the foreskin. So prepuce is the fancy word for the foreskin. So just drawing a very crude picture of this. So if we have the shaft of the penis here, and then here is the glands, and then the urethral opening there. So the foreskin comes round like this, okay? And this inside lining of the foreskin here, this is covered by preputial mucosa, by non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, and this is called the preputial mucosa. So that is non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. In addition, the covering of the glands is also a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. So we have examples of non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium on the male external genitalia as well, and these are susceptible to HPV infection in addition. Okay, in addition we have the urethral lining in both the male and female is a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, so the urethral lining, so the inside lining of the urethra, which is the tube from the bladder to the outer world, so the urethral lining is another example of a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. Finally, I've got two more examples. So more examples, and I think I'll, rather than continuing this downwards, I'll put some here. So the lining of the anus is also a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, and then also the oral cavity is a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, along with the oropharynx behind it. So just to make sure everyone understands what is meant by the oropharynx, if I just draw a sagittal section through the head, so here is the nose, here are the lips, here's the chin, etc. So here's the nasal cavity here, here's the oral cavity here, and then behind them comes the pharynx, which connects both the oral cavity and the nasal cavity like so, and then it will split into the larynx going this way and then the esophagus going backwards. Okay, so this is obviously the oral cavity, everyone knows what that is. This is the pharynx, all of this, and the pharynx can be split into three different bits: the nasopharynx, which is behind the nasal cavity, the oropharynx, which is behind the oral cavity, and then the laryngopharynx, which is this bit down here, where the larynx comes off here. So the oral cavity and the oropharynx, they are covered by a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium. And indeed, you can get HPV infections in those areas. Right, okay, so now we have talked then about squamous stratified epithelia. So let me just summarise what we've learned, and then I want to talk about an important little point about what happens if you get a microabrasion to the squamous stratified epithelia. So, what have we learnt so far then? So we have learnt that squamous stratified epithelia are multi-layered epithelia. Epithelia, by the way, in case you're unaware, are coverings of the body, and the outer layer of cells are going to be flat. So, the bottommost layer is the basement membrane. On top of that, you have this layer of basal cells, which are the stem cells which give rise to the entire squamous stratified epithelium. And these are the only cells that are dividing in the squamous stratified epithelium. All of these cells are not capable of dividing. Well, they are once you get an HPV infection. However, they're normally, in normal physiology, they are not dividing. So, to make a squamous stratified epithelium, all you actually need is the basal cells. They make all of the layers on top. So what happens is a basal cell will divide, and one of the progeny will remain as a basal cell, the other one will move up and begin this differentiation process. And we have come up with this, I haven't come up with this, we're using this very simple classification of the layers of the squamous stratified epithelium into these three layers, where we've just got a mid-zone and a superficial zone on top of the basal cell layer. And in the mid-zone, you have cells that are not yet squamous. They're very big and round, and they're getting ready to become squamous, but they're very different shape to the basal cells. So the cell will gradually move up through the mid-zone, and then once it gets into the superficial zone, it changes its properties again and becomes squamous. And then, depending on whether we're talking about a keratinized or a non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, if we're talking about a keratinized one, in this superficial zone, the cells become absolutely overloaded with the cytoskeletal component keratin, and they lose their nuclei by the time that they're in the outermost layer of the superficial zone. If we're talking about non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelia, that doesn't happen. They don't become overloaded with keratin in the same way, and they retain their nucleus right until the point that they're in this most superficial layer of the superficial zone. Okay, so that's squamous stratified epithelia. let me now talk about microabrasions, because this is actually a very important thing to understand when we're talking about human papillomavirus infections. So I now want to talk about what happens if you get a microabrasion. So a microabrasion is a small injury to the epidermis, or indeed, sorry, not just to the epidermis, to a squamous stratified epithelium, potentially the epidermis or one of the other ones. And what happens in a microabrasion is that you lose all of the cell layers of the squamous stratified epithelium, and all you're left with is the basement membrane. So let me just extend my picture a little bit. So back to the red pen. Here is the basement membrane coming a little bit more here. So let's say that we have had a horrible microabrasion in this region and we no longer have cells in this region. So all of the cells here have gone, okay? You've just got the basement membrane left. How does the squamous stratified epithelium repair after a microabrasion? Well, it does have a fantastic ability to repair. It's one of the best examples of being able to actually repair in the entire body. Lots of tissues, like the brain, if an abrasion happened to the brain, it wouldn't be able to heal. The heart, again, when you have a heart attack, it doesn't heal very well at all. But the squamous stratified epithelia, they do actually have regeneration ability. And the way that you reproduce this squamous stratified epithelium here is using these basal cells in the neighbouring bit that is okay. So what will now happen is these basal cells here, they will divide, and rather than one of the progeny staying a basal cell and one moving up, both of the progeny will become basal cells. So you can repopulate the basal cells is what my message is here with regards to microabrasions. So let me just draw this. So this basal cell here will now give rise to 2 basal cells when it divides. And then this one here, when it divides, it can give rise to 2 basal cells. And gradually you can repopulate the basal cell layer here. And then of course, once you've repopulated the basal cell layer can then produce all of the layers on top. So you can regenerate this squamous stratified epithelium. So that's my message, that if you get a microabrasion that takes out all of the layers of cells here, the surrounding layers of squamous stratified epithelium, the basal cell layer can regenerate itself, can replace the cells that were lost in this area where the microabrasion has happened, and once you've replaced the basal cell layer, then it can produce all of the layers on top of that, so you can get the squamous stratified epithelium reborn. Okay, so that's the message, and this becomes important when we want to discuss human papillomavirus infection. So, human papillomaviruses infect squamous stratified epithelia. Specifically, we'll see that they actually infect the basal cells of squamous stratified epithelia. They can't enter the other cells, they have to initially infect the basal cell layer. So, to finish off this introductory portion of the video, what I'd like to now talk about is the human papillomaviruses, the different types of human papillomaviruses. So let's come down here and do this. So we're now going to talk about the different types of human papillomaviruses. So the first thing I want to say is that there is not just one human papillomavirus. It is the human papillomaviruses. There are loads of different types, and I suppose I should probably write out the name in full at some point in this video, so I'll do this now. So HPV stands for human papillomaviruses. And as I say, my first message is that there is not just one human papillomavirus. There are loads of different types. In fact, as it stands currently, we know of over 120 different types. So there are greater than 120 types of human papillomaviruses. And as the years go by, we discover more and more different types of human papillomaviruses, which is why I'm not bothering to give you the exact number that we know at the moment. I would have had to, find some absolutely up-to-date paper to get the number of human papillomaviruses that we know at the moment, and then it would have been out of date in a few years' time, and we'd have discovered more. So that's why I'm not giving you an exact number of how many human papillomaviruses there are known, because it will just change. We keep discovering more. So at the moment, there is greater than 120 different types of human papillomaviruses. So, first message, how do you actually name these human papillomavirus different types? Well, thankfully, there's a very simple naming system. All you do is you put a number after HPV. So HPV 1 is type 1 human papillomavirus. HPV 16 is type 16 human papillomavirus. So that's just how you name human papillomaviruses. You put a number after HPV. So this is the way that we name the different types. Okay, now we can divide all of the human papillomaviruses into two major categories: those that infect keratinized squamous stratified epithelia and those that infect non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelia. Now, keratinized squamous stratified epithelia, because the only example is the skin, we often just refer to those as cutaneous HPVs. So, human papillomaviruses which infect the epidermis, the keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, we refer to those as cutaneous HPVs. Whereas HPVs which infect non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelium, we refer to those as mucosal HPVs, because another name for non-keratinized squamous stratified epithelia is mucosal squamous stratified epithelia. So we can divide the human papillomaviruses into these two categories, the cutaneous and the mucosal HPVs. So let me give you a few examples from each of these categories. So remembering the cutaneous HPVs is really simple. So some examples are HPV1, HPV2, HPV3, and HPV4. So those are some nice examples of cutaneous HPVs. Obviously, there are loads more than just those four, but if you want to quote a few examples of cutaneous HPVs, those are some good ones to give. Now, some examples of mucosal HPVs. These are a little bit more difficult to remember, so some very important examples to know about are 6, 11, 16, 18. So those four are the ones that you must learn. If you want to be really fancy, add on to this list 31, 33, and 45. So these ones are dispensable in your knowledge. You don't need to know those. You must know about 16 and 18. They are the major causes of cervical cancer, 16 in particular. 6 and 11 are very important, as I'll explain in a moment as well. Okay, so what have we found out about human papillomaviruses so far? We know that there are lots of different types. All of them, absolutely all of them, infect squamous stratified epithelia, and they do not, they do not cause systemic infections. They just infect squamous stratified epithelia. They do not go underneath the basement membrane. So they are not generally imminently dangerous viruses, although obviously they're famous because in the long term they can lead to cancer forming in certain areas. So long termly they are dangerous, but acutely they are not dangerous. Okay, now HPVs, they can be split into two major categories: those that infect cutaneous squamous stratified epithelia, i.e. the skin, epidermis, and those that infect the mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, which are all of these examples that we spent so long going through here. So they can infect all of these different areas. Now, obviously, human papillomaviruses have a very bad reputation recently because of the association between infection by human papillomaviruses in the ectocervix and the formation of cancer of the ectocervix, known as squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix. So I'll just write that key term down. So if you get cancer of the ectocervix, cancer of this squamous stratified epithelium, so cancer arising from the cells of this squamous stratified epithelium of the ectocervix, that is known as squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix. I'll put this here. So human papillomaviruses have got a very bad reputation because of the realization that they can lead to squamous cell carcinoma formation in the ectocervix. Now, this has led us to divide the mucosal HPVs into two different types, namely the low-risk mucosal HPVs and the high-risk mucosal HPVs. So we have low-risk LR HPVs, and then we have the high-risk human papillomaviruses, the HR HPVs. So if you get infected with a high-risk human papillomavirus on one of your mucosal surfaces, and by the way, it is not just the ectocervix that is at risk of this. If you get an HPV infection anywhere on any of these different mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, we're now beginning to understand that if it's a high-risk HPV infection, it puts you at risk of getting cancer in that area. And actually, can I just take a step back? We'll come back to this low-risk and high-risk HPVs. I just want to firstly talk about warts before we come on to low-risk and high-risk. So ignore that I've mentioned that for now. Let me just talk about warts for a moment. So imagine that we have erased this purple bit. We've just talked about the fact that there are these two different types, two different categories of human papillomaviruses, the cutaneous HPVs and the mucosal HPVs. When you get an HPV infection on one of your squamous stratified epithelium, whether it's on your skin or whether it's on one of these mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, it can lead to a wart forming there. It doesn't necessarily lead to it. You can have a silent, effectively, HPV infection on an area of squamous stratified epithelium where you don't get any visible changes. You don't get a wart forming there, but the infection is nevertheless there. But very often they can lead to the formation of warts, and we have two fancy names for warts. Papillomas is the name for a skin wart, a cutaneous wart. So common areas for papillomas to form are on the hands and the feet. So palmar warts are the names for warts on the hands, and plantar warts are names for warts on the feet, and these are often called verrucas. Verrucae, I think, is the plural. So plantar warts, also called verrucas. Actually, I think it is just verrucas, so I'm going to get rid of that E. Whoops. Verrucas. Well, there's a verruca. Okay, so if you get an HPV infection on the skin by a cutaneous HPV, it can lead to the formation of a papilloma, which is the fancy word for a cutaneous wart. And the common areas for these to form are on the hands or on the feet. However, they can in principle form anywhere on the body, on the skin. Now, if you get a wart on one of your mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, that is then called a condyloma. And a condyloma is the fancy word for a genital wart. So I don't think you'd use condyloma to mean a wart on the oropharynx or the oral squamous stratified epithelium, but a wart on any of the other regions, so for instance the urethral lining, the preputial mucosa, the vagina, or the ectocervix, or the anus, or the vulvar mucosa. On any one of those, you would refer to that as a condyloma, which is the fancy word for a genital wart. Okay, so overall my message there is that when you get an HPV infection on one of these squamous stratified epithelium, it can lead to a wart forming, and we have these two fancy terms, papillomas, which is obviously the origin of the name human papillomavirus, the virus that causes warts, and condylomas, which are when they form on the genital mucosal squamous stratified epithelia. Now, coming back then to high-risk and low-risk HPVs. So we divide now the mucosal HPVs, which are the ones that can infect these mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, into these two categories: low-risk human papillomaviruses, which can only cause warts. The worst things they can do are cause warts. So they won't lead to the formation of cancer if you get one of these low-risk mucosal HPV infections. And examples are HPV 6 and 11. And the reason that those are really important examples to know is that usually if someone gets a genital wart, it's usually one of these that is causing it rather than one of the high-risk human papillomaviruses. So 6 and 11 are the famous examples that you should know as the major causes of genital warts, and they are not dangerous. They will not lead to the formation of cancer on the area where the genital wart has occurred. Whereas the high-risk human papillomaviruses, if you get a mucosal infection by one of those, it can lead to the formation of cancer at that area. So the major examples are 16 and 18. These are the two most important ones. 16 is the most important one. It's the leader. It's the cause, they think, of 60% of squamous cell carcinomas of the cervix. And 18 is the second in command. It's the cause of another 10% of squamous cell carcinomas of the cervix. So these two are the most important ones to learn from the example of high-risk mucosal HPVs. To add a few on to your knowledge, 31, 33 and 45 are also mucosal high-risk human papillomaviruses. They're not as prevalent as 16 and 18, so not as bad as these two, but they are other notable examples. Okay, so let's summarise what I've told you so far. So we have these two categories of human papillomaviruses which infect the two different types of squamous stratified epithelium. We've seen that they can lead to warts forming on those tissues when you get those squamous stratified epithelial infections, and we've given some fancy terms. And by the way, you can get warts forming in the oral cavity and the oropharynx. It's just I don't know what the fancy word for that would be, just an oral wart. I don't think you'd call it a condyloma. A condyloma means a genital wart. But you can get warts forming anywhere where you get an HPV infection. But the other crucial thing to say is that you don't necessarily get a wart. Okay, if you're unlucky enough, you get a visible sign of the infection. If you are luckier, you'll have the infection effectively silent. You won't know you've got it there. So when the HPVs infect these squamous stratified epithelia, they can lead to the formation of a wart on that area. Finally, what we've seen is that the mucosal HPVs, some of them can actually give rise to cancer, and these are called the high-risk mucosal HPVs, and the ones that can't give rise to cancer are the low-risk HPVs, and we've seen examples from our great big long list that are in each of these categories. Now, obviously the famous example of how they can cause cancer is cancer of the ectocervix, squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix. However, if you get a high-risk HPV infection on any of the other mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, so for instance on the vagina, on the vulval mucosa, on the urethral lining, on the preputial mucosa, or on the anus, or indeed on the oral cavity or the oropharynx, it can lead to cancer there as well. It's just that the association isn't as strong as for squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix. For squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix, we think that you pretty much have to have the high-risk HPV infection to get cancer there, i.e. if you never get a high-risk HPV infection of the ectocervix, you will never get squamous cell carcinoma of the cervix. We think that this is necessary for the formation of cancer of the ectocervix, whereas for cancer in these other regions, these other mucosal squamous stratified epithelia, the association is not as strong. You can get cancer in those regions without having a high-risk HPV infection. The high-risk HPV infection just increases your chance of getting cancer there, which is why HPVs and cervical cancer is the famous topic rather than HPVs and anal cancer, for example. But they do increase your risk of getting cancer wherever they infect. And we similarly think that the cutaneous HPVs, in years to come, we think that they're going to be divided up into low-risk cutaneous HPVs and high-risk cutaneous HPVs, because we think some of these can lead to skin cancer forming. So we think some of these will put you at increased risk of getting skin cancer, but that sort of understanding isn't as advanced as what we have for cervical cancer. So we don't currently divide cutaneous HPVs into low-risk and high-risk categories. However, we think that in the future it will turn out that some of these put you at much increased risk of getting skin cancer in the region where they have infected. Okay, so we will have a break there. In the next video, what we will do is we'll have a look at the structure of HPVs, and then we'll start to look at the entry mechanism by which HPVs originally infect the basal cells of the squamous stratified epithelia. So, I'll see you in the next video.